All right, we've had a chance to take a look at some of the cool build and automated build features, and now it's time that we turn our eyes over to the releases. If you look at the slide, you're going to see a couple phases of the release. We want that integration testing environment, maybe even an environment built on demand. We need a functional testing environment we can test. Maybe some cloud load testing where we can bring in some cloud resources to provide a load against our development or our test environments. We have a pre-production environment, a staging environment, and we're going to go all the way to production. I like that. And that will get us into this cadence where next we can monitor and learn. Now, before we continue, I want to hit one more thing. We're showing you a website, and we're kind of narrowing our focus. But you need to have a broader focus if you're building and delivering other sorts of environments. So for instance, you probably somewhere in your organization are delivering mobile experiences. So instead of deploying out to an Azure website, you're going to use a service called Hockey App, and you're going to deploy out to that service, and that'll bring it out to those Android phones or those iOS phones, where we can then test against those and get feedback actually from customers there. So taking a look at the slide, you'll see some of the pros of that tool that you can use. You can distribute our apps. We can grab crash reports. All of those are brought up, immediately reported. We can look at usability of our app, how users are using it. We can track adoption across the organization, across the world, anywhere we want to track. And we can find that metadata around it as well. So again, wanted to make sure that we discuss a little bit about the mobile side of the house with Hockey App before we go into just showing what it's like when we're using the web and the app service experience that we get directly from Azure. So off to the demo, and back to you once again for this demo on releases.
Thank you, Steve. So I've opened up the release view, and you may have seen this a bit earlier. Last time we looked at this, build 10063 was in all three environments. Now, if you notice, the dev environment says 10065. So we know that the 10065 build is deployed out in dev. It's green, gives us a good indicator that everything worked according to plan in that environment. So let's go over and edit that environment, just so I can show you how we've set up this environment definition. So again, as I mentioned, the agent for build and release is actually the same agent. So that's why this looks like the build definition. Again, we get to put in a number of tasks that need to execute on a number of environments. So here you can see we've got a dev environment where we execute a list of tasks. Then we go over to the staging environment where we may do some similar and some different tasks. You can see there's some fewer tasks there. And over to production as well. So we can orchestrate what tasks and activities happen on each environment through the pipeline. Going back to the dev, I'd like to start off with this first task. So we tell our customers all the time, one of the things you want to do before going into release is monitor code coverage.
Absolutely. It's part of your whole unit testing effort and the first bar you cross for quality.
Right. So we've been telling our customers, go and look at the build, because you know which build is being deployed into your release, and go and check the code coverage to see if it's increased or decreased. Hopefully it hasn't decreased.
That's the worst case scenario.
That would be an indication that there's something wrong. Maybe you added some code but didn't test it. Right? That would lead to a decrease in code coverage. So this first task is a coverage gate, and this comes out of my build extensions. And this is where you can actually say, as long as the delta is greater than or equal to 0, in other words, it hasn't moved down, we'll continue with the release. So here again, we're using the tool to start enforcing some of these quality gates. The next one is very pertinent to this course, because this is how we do our deployment to Azure of the infrastructure that we're deploying to. So what this is doing is it's grabbing the template that we published alongside of our binaries that built during the build process, and we're using the Azure deployment task to go and deploy out the resources that are defined in our ARM template.
This again comes back to that infrastructure as code. So right at the beginning, if we have no environment, this will actually go out and create the environment for us. It'll deploy the SQL DB and fill it with its appropriate contents. It'll deploy the app service with all of the websites. It'll deploy the things like App Insights. It deploys all of the things that we need for this thing to run. As part of this demo, we give it slightly different ways at times. I tend to go in and destroy everything in Azure so that the websites are 404. Nothing's there. They're just gone. And as part of that build, up they appear, and then there they are. All of a sudden, that first deployment builds them up in Azure and makes them appear. Now, that's not a common need. We wanted to go the day in the life experience here. And so I think it's better that we're not showing that. But I do want to say a secondary demo that I'll often give is to, instead of changing that cost, the discount, you can go in and change the size of the environment for which you're deploying as well. Scale up the environment, scale down the environment, add different capabilities to the Azure resources in the back end. And the interesting thing is, it's the same workflow, but I'm making infrastructure changes based on the version control changes exactly like you are doing right there with the 15% change.
Absolutely. And I love this because this is tying together the concept of I've done some code, but in order for this code to get into the hands of my users, it needs to be deployed somewhere. And I, as a developer, need to understand what resources are required to run this application and how to set those resources up. And of course, with Azure, this becomes a lot easier to do because I don't have to requisition servers or do anything like that. I have this template, which is source controlled, so I can see the history on the template, and we can tweak the environment from source control.
Yes, and I want to take a quick side note. This is a way you can deploy a couple different ways. You might have multiple development efforts, all targeting a single environment. And so you want to be, you might think, oh my goodness, I can't use this type of source code to do that. Not true. You have the ARM templates, but you can deploy them in two ways, incremental or complete. And if you deploy an incremental one, it'll just make the changes in that incremental push. If you make a complete one, it'll rebuild everything to make it to match exactly what you want. It doesn't actually rebuild. It just makes sure it matches your ARM template exactly.
Right.
So if you're sharing an infrastructure, you end up with incremental ones. In our case, we like the complete ones. Why? Because we may want to tear things down if we want to as part of a demo.
The next task in the task list here, if we come back to the release definition, is to deploy the website from our code, which is sitting in this web deploy package, and we're going to target an app service, a web app, inside of Azure, which has just been created by running the Azure Resource Manager template. So it may be empty, it may have old code there. We don't need to know or care because this will just work. If there's nothing there, it'll deploy it. If there's something there, it'll update it for us. And you'll see that I'm deploying to the slot and I'm deploying to the dev slot. So in the dev environment here, I'm deploying to the dev slot. I could, of course, be deploying to a completely separate app service totally in each environment. Here, the way we've decided to divvy this up is to have slots that represent our different environments. But you could do it however you need to. Then the last task here that I want to mention is we're doing a quick web performance test. It is possible to run unit tests during this release. What's more typical is to run integration tests because at this point you have deployed out a database or whatever other external resources your software is dependent on. Sometimes those are hard to run during builds because your builds don't know about the environments where the bits are going to be deployed out to.
Yes.
But here in release, we're intimately concerned and we have intimate knowledge of exactly where we're deploying, what the database is, what the other dependent services are. So this is the perfect point to run those integration tests. And we can run the same tests on different environments as we move through this pipeline. So we can add Selenium tests here, coded UI tests, do whatever tests we need to. In this case, we've chosen to just do a quick web performance test, which is going to just hammer the root of our website with 25 users for 60 seconds. Just kind of make sure the website's up, that it's giving us 200s, that everything looks okay. And of course, we could do more elaborate load tests at this point. That would require us to go and create web and performance tests and load tests, but we could integrate these into the pipeline. So Testing Forms is a first-party citizen of this pipeline. So let's go and look at the state of the release that's in flight at the moment. So here is the release 10065-1. And if we just look over at the environment symbols, let me zoom in a bit here, you can see that we've got green in the dev environment, but we've got gray in staging and in production. And in fact, the gray bar in staging has got a little stopwatch icon there. It's waiting for something. So what is it waiting for? It's waiting for an approval. Let's go back to the definition so I can show you how we configured the approvals. So here on the staging environment, I'm going to bring out the menu and select Configure Variables. Sorry. I'm going to click on this ellipsis here and select Assign Approvers. Here we can see that for each environment, you've got an incoming deployment opportunity as well as an outgoing or post-deployment approval opportunity. And so here we can configure if approvers are necessary. On the dev environment, we have no one deploying either in or out. It's just going to deploy, and once the deployment succeeds, we're good. And once we get into the staging environment, we want a deployer to say, yes, I'm ready to accept the build into this environment.
Now, why on earth would I have an approval before I go into that environment? Why before?
Yep.
Why not after? So before we go to prod?
Right. So this is a great question, Steve. So I know it doesn't happen in your organization, but in other organizations, sometimes when developers deploy things, things break. So that's what the post-approval is for. We want to go in and check what's happening after the deployment to make sure that everything is correct and works correctly. The pre-deployment allows us to tell release management when we're ready to actually receive a build in. Let's say that you have a couple of testers who are busy testing the previous build. Now, they might be halfway through a testing cycle. You don't want to blow away the environment that they're testing until they're ready to actually start testing on the latest build.
Yep.
So this is an opportunity for you to put that pre-deployment point in where the test team can go and say, yes, I see there's a new build incoming. I'm ready for it now, or they can maybe defer that deployment to a time that they want to. While we're here, I wanted to look at deployment conditions, since this shows how environments flow in the pipeline. So this trigger here says we only want to trigger to the staging environment after a successful deployment to the dev environment. And you'll see that I can actually select multiple environments here. So this is where if I have multiple environments, I can fan out and fan in and deploy in parallel across multiple environments if I need to. And I can do this fan out and fan in with the approvals along the pipeline. So we can build out this flow from environment to environment, giving more strict gates as we go from left to right, which is pretty typical. So if we go back to the actual in-flight release, if I click on that little stopwatch icon, you can see that we've set up approvals from either Rennie or Steve. Now, Steve is here, but I'm going to...
You can pass it over to me. Go ahead and pass it over if you would.
I'll pass it over to you, Steve.
It's going to come over to my screen, and if you take a quick look at me, you'll see that there's this pre-deployment approval pending. Now that we're on my screen, I can come up and say, let's go. I'm ready for this. I could reassign the approval. Yeah,
maybe you want to check the environment before you approve it.
Oh, that's a good point. Let me pop up and check the environment and go back to home on this particular one. Good point. 16%, it looks good. I'm ready to push it through. So let me go back. That's a great practice, by the way. You should always validate things before you just say, let's go. I could also defer this deployment to a later time if I wanted to. Maybe approve it, but let it run automatically at night. I'm going to simply approve this from my side, and then you'll notice that it's changed to a different one. It's staged, and it's currently queued. So at this point, that build is now up, getting ready to run, and it's going to take and move it from that development environment out to the staging environment. Now, from there, I'm going to pass this back over to Colin so we can look at Colin's screen to see where does this go from here.
Thank you, Steve. So let's open up that in-flight release, and you can see that it's updating to show that it's in progress in the staging environment, thanks to Steve's approval into the staging environment. And here we get a summary screen for what's going on in this particular deployment. So again, we can see who triggered or what event triggered this release. It was a continuous deployment request from Stephen because he approved that commit, and we can see that it's gone through dev. If we click on that, it'll open up a history of what's gone on in dev, and I can see which builds have come in, which have succeeded, which have failed, and so on. Let's go back to the summary here. We can also see the work items. Which work items are coming in this release? And again, we're beating this drum about work items linked to source control, which flows through to the build, which now is flowing through to the release. And so you're getting this nice tie-in across all of these different artifacts and different disciplines in the team, just in the daily flow.
It is a worthwhile drum to beat. I spend so much time working with development teams that have no connection with the rest of the organization, where testers are isolated or the business people are isolated. And you have project managers and program managers who don't know what's going on, and releases are coordinated on some crazy calendar somewhere instead of being coordinated and understood from a deep perspective of release of value out to customers. And that's where it's all about. Anyway, I'm again beating that drum. Let me go back to the demo on this one.
So we can see that the staging is still in progress. We can see that the post-deployment approval icon is now lit up, right? So we can see it's after, so we presumably have deployed successfully. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that we have load test results in both dev and staging. Now I've gone ahead and opened up one of the results for those load tests. Let's go first to the summary. And here you can see we've got an average response time of 354 milliseconds. Not too bad for a home page. We probably could have improved there a little bit.
For a free website.
Yeah. We did manage to get 80 requests per second in there. We have 0 failures, which is good. And we get some details there. What is really neat is to see the performance chart. So even though we've only run this for 60 seconds, we still get a ton of telemetry out right in the midst of our deployment that can point us in potential performance issues. So I wanted to show that because I really like the way the cloud tests actually show up. The other important thing about this is I didn't spin up any machines. If you've ever wanted to do any load testing before the days of VSTS and cloud load testing, well, you had to spin up some machines, and you had the limitation of 250 virtual users per machine. So if you wanted to run a test with 1,000 users, you had to spin up 4 machines, so you had to have virtual machines or hardware. Maybe you had to requisition them. And then after the load test, you had 4 machines that sat around doing nothing. Right? And so now cloud load testing gives us the capability to spin up resources, run the load tests, and throw them away afterwards, and we only pay for what we've used.
I love it. Again, it's that cloud piece. Pay for what you use. It goes to 0 when you're done using it. Just
love it.
Make that happen in your organization.
Love it. So let's go back to the release, and we can do the post approval. This time, since I have permissions to, I'm going to override Rennie's post approval. At this point, Rennie would go and check staging, make sure he's done. In a staging environment, typically, this is where your testers would run their manual tests, and once they're happy with the bits in that environment, come back here to do their post approval sign off. So we'll say, excellent. And hit approve.
I love the fact, too, that when you just approved for Rennie, it doesn't track that Rennie approved it. It does stick it on you, that you overrode it and approved it. So it's not like Rennie made that approval. You overrode it, it's on you.
Good point. Now you'll see that even though we've come successfully out of staging, we still have pre-deployment approval for production. And again, we may not have a test team here, but maybe you only want to deploy out of business hours, for example, right?
Sure.
So again, that gives us this point to say, everything's looking good here. The build is ready to go into production. When do we want to actually do that deployment? And so again, here we can do the same thing. We can approve. We can defer the deployment till we're ready. Should I go ahead and approve?
Go ahead. Let's approve it.
Let's
Get it
do
into
it.
production.
So we'll hit approve, and that'll start the deployment tasks into the production slot.
Now that normally takes a little while, so we, magic of video editing, moved forward quickly, and we can see now what it looks like on your screen, Colin.
So again, everything's looking good. We're seeing a lot of green, which is fantastic. Again, we're seeing the load tests running in all 3 of our environments. And again, this could be different sets of tests running in the environments. So from a release point of view, it's looking good. Let's go and actually look at the sites and make sure that everything has deployed out according to how we expect it. So I'm going to switch over to the Dev tab, and we'll hit refresh. And you can see we're on 16%. Right?
Perfect.
I'm going to skip staging and just go straight to production, and we'll refresh that. And you can see it's on 16%. We've successfully migrated our code change through dev, through staging, to production. We've done the automated build. No one had to actually go and queue the build. No one had to sit and figure out which assemblies are required. That's all encapsulated in the build. We didn't even have to go and push any code ourselves because we set that up in the release, and the release triggered as soon as the build was successful. I love the way this ties everything together. From I've done my commits. I know it took a while to show the whole demo, but really, if we did the commit, we could go all the way through to production in a matter of a few minutes.
Yeah, and if needed be, if it was an urgent bug fix, we could have gone right to dev, done some quick checks, and pushed straight over to production. Just skipped over.
Right.
Not a recommended practice
Yes.
by any stretch, but possible. And we've only touched the very tip of what's possible with the build and release portion of this. So get out there, get your releases going. Make sure you've got that good ARM template that you can use for configuration as code and infrastructure as code. Get these deployments going quickly and efficiently up into Azure, and it'll change your paradigm and it'll change the way you work to start getting that cloud-focused work back down, that cloud-first view of working embedded in your organization. Next up, we're going to learn from what we've pushed to production and highlight some of those things to influence what we should be working on next.